I love vampires. Pretty much always have. And short of actually becoming one in real life, and here's to hoping, kinda, the only option I or the rest of us have is to either adopt a very specialized lifestyle, or the far safer option, portray one in a game. Now, I have played my share of vampire games over the years, most especially the tabletop RPG Vampire the Masquerade. I love the mystery, the politicking, and the mythology of that setting. And while the Bloodlines RPG is indeed a classic that has never really died, no pun intended, but I'll take it, in recent years I have been jonesing for a newer, fresher vampire experience. Enter 2018's Vampyr, or Vampyr. Well, for the sake of distinction, I'll say Vampyr. Vampyr is an interesting game. While it has combat and action elements at its core, it is a far more narrative... I'm reading from a script, by the way. It is a far more narrative-driven game than anything else. You play as Dr. Jonathan Reed, a brilliant surgeon who just returned to 1918 London from the battlefield of World War I, who finds himself waylaid into a hidden world of vampires and thousand-year curses, all the while attempting to help cure a Spanish influenza epidemic that is raging through the city. Along the way, you meet the denizens of the various districts of London, and, if you so choose, learn all about them, their lives, their connections to the wider world, to vampires, and to other NPCs. They might provide you with side quests, lore about what's going on with the epidemic, or the vampires, or give you background on the situation in London just after the war. Depending on how you respond to certain people, how you fulfill certain quests, or even if you choose to rescue or murder certain people, all of it can lead to different consequences for other characters and can affect certain story elements. Overall, I really like this game. Its mood, its art style, the voice acting, the music, and I became particularly excited about the unique lore behind the vampires in the setting. And yet I found myself craving more options for things to do, more ways in which I could further affect the story and the world around me as one of the undead. The game and its mechanics only hint at the possibilities for a larger role-playing experience. Vampyr was made by a relatively small team on a modest budget, so I don't really begrudge the developers for not having everything in the kitchen sink in their first outing. But I see a lot of potential in some of the game's core mechanics for the sort of vampire role-playing experience I'm really looking for. And so, in this scripted, but live, for reference, video, I thought I would unleash my gamer nerd imagination on what I would want to see in a hypothetical Vampyr 2. Now, as preamble, this essay of mine assumes you already have a working knowledge of the first game, its themes, and its mechanics. I won't be spending too much time rehashing the details about the first game, save for how aspects of it relate to my ideas for a sequel. So if you're looking for an in-depth tutorial on the first Vampyr game, this isn't it. Likewise, from here on out, there be spoilers. All of that being said, let us proceed. Part 1. Blood. The primary pursuit of all classic vampires is blood, and the nature of blood in the first Vampyr game was weird. If you were to feed from a named civilian NPC, for example, you would first need to attain a particular mesmerism level, of which all were locked behind specific chapter events in the first game's main narrative. And after mesmerizing an accessible civilian NPC and leading them off to a dark corner, your only option was to drain them dry and kill them. Live or die, that's it. And when it came to applying your fangs in combat, no mesmerism is necessary, and you can feed from enemies without killing them with your bite. So the question I kept asking myself throughout the game was, why do I have to kill the civilians? Why can't I just delve into their lives, keep them healthy, and make them available to me as friendly blood bags to feed on in the future? Why can't I cultivate a safe food source? Tied to this, of course, is that... Let me try that again. Tied to this, of course, is that the need for blood during play is unimportant. You can roam the entire map with an empty blood bar, and suffer no ill effects, save for an inability to cast your blood-based powers. You can also speak to other characters while completely famished, and there's no consequence to your interactions, even though you are a blood-starved undead monster. This runs contrary to the mindless hunger situation we are presented with at the very opening of the first game, a consequence of starvation that we never see again. Not only do these mismatched and perplexing mechanics confuse the lore that underpins the vampires in this setting, it also makes the importance of blood practically unimportant at worst, or an afterthought at best to both the setting and the gameplay. In a hypothetical Vampyr 2, I would alter the mechanics of blood as follows. 1. The more you befriend and or discover more details about a civilian NPC, the difficulty to mesmerize them lowers accordingly. This reflects that your efforts to get to know them, to insinuate yourself into their life, has lowered their guard in response to you, and thus makes it easier for your mental powers to dominate them. Obviously, there would need to be some limitations to ensure that plot-centric NPCs cannot be too quickly mesmerized and taken away to be killed, but in this way, each NPC becomes a goal in and of themselves to investigate and to conquer. Number 2. After mesmerizing a civilian, you would have two options: feed or kill. If you simply feed from them, you gain a bit of blood and let them go. The amount that a feeding nourishes your blood bar is tied directly to their bodily health, as in the first game. The healthier the person is, the greater the blood gain from feeding on them will be. If you decide to kill them, that's when you get an XP boost. Maybe. I'll get to the mechanics of gaining XP from civilian murder shortly. Number 3. Having too little blood in your system starts having outward detriments to your character and thus the gameplay. As examples, if you don't have enough blood in your system, you lose your passive and stamina-based supernatural abilities. You cannot shadow jump or shadow dodge. As well, you cannot use vampiric sight if you're out of blood. If you have next to no blood in your system, or your blood bar is empty, you begin to move very sluggishly, and your ability to physically dodge attacks, in the absence of shadow dodging, is greatly impaired. Basically, think of the physical effects when the priest shines his faith on you in the first game, and that is a vampire who is starving in Vampyr 2. Number 4. The benefits from combat feeding need to be severely nerfed, specifically the skill that increases the amount of blood you get from using your bite in combat. You should still be able to get blood in combat, but you shouldn't be able to fill half or all of your blood bar in a single bite. Essentially, keep the skill, but reduce its benefit percentages. Number 5. One of the things I wished I could do in the first game was to stalk my prey through the streets of London, grabbing them at the most opportune time. So in Vampyr 2, the streets would not be absent of civilians in the non-hub areas of the map. In the early stages, the world would be populated with a scattering of unnamed civilian passerby. Hunters would only be regularly present if due to player actions, or the hunter faction had a solid control of a district. And I'll get to the hunter faction shortly. The player character could feed on random civilians, but at great risk of discovery. Think of the masquerade rating in Bloodlines. If you're witnessed being vampire-y, the likelihood of the district having hunters or other enemies appear increases. Blood needs to be vital to a vampire's life and ability to function, but it also needs to be a relatively scarce resource unless the player creates a reliable source of it. By making it more of a necessity, as compared to the first game, and by allowing a player the ability to build up their own blood supply through roleplay, you make blood drive both the mechanics and the narrative choices of the player character. Combat. In general, I don't have a problem with the combat in the first game. It could certainly use some polish. The lock-on mechanic in particular became more of a liability to me than a benefit when trying to deal with several enemies at once. But most of the vampiric abilities were appropriately useful at lower levels, and only the master powers ever felt, and rightly so, overpowered if you choose to dump that much XP into getting them. So overall, the combat and combat abilities system from the first game doesn't need too much attention, in my opinion, except for maybe some streamlining of the controls. But that is because, first and foremost, this is a narrative experience more than it is a hardcore combat adventure. My Vampyr 2 would not make the mistake of trying to be all things to all people. Character. Rather than having a set character to play, as you did in the shoes of Jonathan Reed in the first game, this time around players would have the ability to make their own character with their own name and with relatively little established about them. In short, the player character would be a blank slate, and in my opinion, necessarily so. Why? Well, one of the difficulties I had in really feeling a sense of narrative freedom, and most importantly a moral struggle while playing Jonathan Reed, was that the very opening of Vampyr, we understand that he is a moral man. He is a doctor, a war hero, and a very regretful murderer. In a flashback, we see him risking death at the hands of oncoming enemy forces in order to buy more time to save a wounded soldier's life. Thus, he has a very fervent and obvious morality. As I turn the page. Having such a concrete and demonstrable moral compass established for the protagonist from the get-go made it consistently nonsensical as to why that character would ever kill an innocent person. I never felt like there was a moral choice for me to make as a player because the very nature of the character I was portraying had been firmly established as a healer and as a hero. But even so, if you do decide to slaughter innocent people, the main thrust of the narrative never really wavers, and the only noticeable shift in the character's attitude as a result of such atrocity occurs at the very end of the game, and not very satisfyingly so, in my opinion. So in Vampyr 2, in order for the player to both invest a little bit of themselves and then their chosen morality into the player character, the player character itself needs to be a blank slate. And similarly, the player character needs to be voiceless. It is a throwback to RPGs of old, like Fallout 3 and Knights of the Old Republic. However, not having a set voice as well allows the player to invest a bit more of themselves into their role in the game, and having to choose how to respond to other characters with fully transparent statements makes each dialogue choice much more personal than simply clicking a summary statement from a dialogue wheel. In addition, to better customize things for the player, and as well to focus on the roleplay aspect, at character creation, you would be asked to choose from one of three backgrounds for your character: aristocrat, middle class, or laborer. The stratification of classes in London in the first Vampyr game was a part of much of the narrative, but it was never a functional barrier or benefit to the outcomes of character interactions. Choosing a literal class for the character in this context would determine which NPCs you end up having unique dialogue options for, and would also determine how some NPCs treat you as opposed to others based on your perceived social standing. Beyond having a narrative background for the character, I think the lack of a skill set from the first game should be retained. No character points to distribute into bartering and melee and science, etc. Like its predecessor, Vampyr 2 should be more about story than about number crunching. Morality. As mentioned, one of the core drivers of Vampyr is your interaction with and the discovery of details about the various NPCs that inhabit the world. And as rich as all of that was in the first game, as much as each NPC had a thought-out role and background within the overall world of Vampyr, none of it really mattered. Because you could literally kill every civilian NPC in the game at the first opportunity presented you, even if you had never really spoken to them at all. And save for a few possible unique enemies appearing later on, and the aesthetics of certain districts and number of enemies therein changing as a result, the main thrust of the narrative never really suffers for it. Even if the entire city is burning down around them, the main storyline NPCs never waver in their actions or motivations, and save for a handful of very minor dialogue shifts, your actions over the course of the game all lead you to the exact same place. The main issue is that most of the NPCs just aren't interesting. I mean, they might be interesting characters in their own right, except for a tiny handful of supporting characters. The question I kept asking myself as I played Vampyr was, why would Jonathan Reed, let alone myself as the player, care about getting to know the finer intricacies of each of these people's lives? Well, the only answer to that question, in fact, the only carrot for that stick the developers provide you, is experience points. The more you discover about a person, the more you delve into their story, as well as see to their bodily health, the more valuable, quote unquote, their blood becomes should you decide to drink them and then kill them. Now, the temptation of do I or don't I is at the heart of Vampyr's attempt at creating a moral conflict for the player. The problem is the moral conflict has nothing to do with the story so much as whether you want a quick XP boost or if you would rather grind out the game without killing civilian NPCs. And the only reason to do that are to get a special achievement and to get the, presumably, most desirable ending to the story. Let me give you an example. Early into the game, you speak to certain NPCs deeply enough into their stories, you discover a bona fide serial killer in your midst. And it's not a vampire. It's a regular person that has been slaughtering people. And this person's loved ones, who know the killer's secret, are not willing to do anything about it. With the influenza epidemic on, and stretching my suspension of disbelief to its limits, no law enforcement around, the question that comes to my mind, and I would assume that of Jonathan Reed, is that if I don't stop this person, they're going to continue killing innocent people. One would think that this would be a major moral crossroads for the character. So, if you kill this person, effectively bringing them to justice and saving the lives of other potential victims, what is your reward? Well, you do get a lot of XP for it, but apparently killing a murderer permanently stains the soul of Jonathan Reed and, counterintuitively, adds to the chances of a decline in the city's habitability and contributes towards getting one of the bad endings of the game. And this is the exact same meta-narrative result as if you choose to let the serial killer live and instead decide to kill a completely harmless widow that you meet about halfway into the game. So, what is the moral reward for saving the day in Vampyr? It is literally no different than being a calloused monster, apparently. In summary, by making experience points the fundamental reward or deficit in the decision to kill a civilian makes who that character is completely irrelevant. And if the backbone of the player experience is how the protagonist relates to these characters, and how those characters thus relate to the protagonist's story, XP dumps for civilian lives is a poison pill against feeling as though your choices as a player actually matter. Now, how would I fix this? Well, that leads us into the questions of theme, setting, and gameplay for my hypothetical sequel. On to theme and setting. In Vampyr 2, even I mistake that, the theme of the game will need to shift completely, but logically, in my opinion, away from that of the first game. The first Vampyr was all about discovery, discovering who made Jonathan Reed a vampire and why, discovering both the cause and the cure for the London epidemic, and discovering the details of all the civilians' lives and their significance to the world. And so, where do we go after discovery? Well, naturally, conquest. And the mechanic of the NPC's reaction to one another on the character map and to the player character's goals will become even more vital towards that end. So, here's my pitch for the setup of the sequel and how that feeds into the theme of the game mechanics. In Vampyr 2, we find ourselves back in London, and once again, walking amid the aftermath of a devastating war. But this time, it's World War II. The Nazis have been defeated in Europe, but the war still rages in the Pacific. Parts of London are still a shambles after the Blitz, and the city is in the process of rebuilding. In the realm of the London vampires, there are 3 secret factions at play, overseen by 3 different leaders, who are in fact the only 3 NPC characters that we know for certain survived the events of the first Vampyr game: Lord Redgrave, Old Bridget, and the vampire hunter McCallum. Dragging themselves out of the wreckage of the war with Germany, the playing field of London has been literally and figuratively leveled. And likewise, each of our 3 factions are seeing an opportunity for dominance as a result. And so what better time for an ambitious vampire to strike out on their own, choose their fate, and begin to conquer their domain? The player character would be a relatively newly made vampire, someone who had been chosen and secretly groomed for this for a number of years prior to the events of the game. Their maker is an established icon of London, but not a character we've previously been introduced to. This maker has guided the player character towards what they say is a great purpose, but that purpose is left ill-defined. The game begins with the death and/or subtraction of said maker from the story. Whether the cause of the maker's death or absence is self-imposed, an accident, or arranged in some fashion might become an important plot in the game, or not. Regardless, it is the way by which the player character is left untethered and open to forming their own alliances. With their maker gone, the player character has to set out alone into the world to establish themselves amongst the city of London and its hidden vampire society. Now, as mentioned, the resolution of the first Vampyr left us with 3 certain leadership figures: Lord Redgrave and his Ascalon Club, Old Bridget of the Sewer Skulls, and McCallum of the Vampire Hunting Guard of Prewin. Each of these characters is looking to rebuild their own power base from the ruins of London, and the progeny of a powerful and respected icon could play an important role in seeing one rise to the top and to the ruin of the others. As well, the abstract positions of each of these characters and their factions can work in concert and in selective opposition to the character classes of aristocrat, middle class, and laborer. Redgrave being the upper crust concerned only with power and the perseverance of England, McCallum working for a kind of stability by curtailing, if not outright destroying, the secret vampire menace, and Old Bridget representing the downtrodden lower class via the Sewer Skulls. Now, a brief aside about cleaning up some of the unavoidable loose ends from the first game. There are a handful of various plot outcomes from the first Vampyr that would need to be attended to early into Vampyr 2 in order to retain continuity. Let's take McCallum, the vampire hunter, for example. McCallum's condition at this point in the story has 2 possibilities, depending on the decisions made in the first game. He still lives, but he may be either human or a vampire. His longevity into the 1940s can thus be explained by one of 2 things. Either he's a vampire, and thus immortal, or the blood of King Arthur he ingested as a human has slowed his aging process. Think Captain America. Now, how is this and other lingering variables resolved in Vampyr 2? Well, I would steal a mechanic familiar to me from Knights of the Old Republic 2 in order to address this and any of the other major unknowns the first game created. What you do is, you have the player dictate the truth using dialogue options early on in the game. As an example, NPC 1 says, "Do you know of McCallum, the fearless vampire killer? They say he's been hunting vampires for 50 years, but he doesn't look a day past 25. I hear it's because he's actually a vampire himself." And then the player can either answer, "Yes, I have been told that as well. An Ekon hunting other Ekons is madness." Or, "Strange, I heard he has the blood of King Arthur running through his veins, not that he's a vampire." In this way, the player can help resolve any lingering continuity questions from the first game themselves. The same goes for the fate of Jonathan Reed and Lady Ashbury, 2 characters that, in my opinion, should not appear in the sequel at all, save for maybe reference, or in a very structured cameo. So, What's the game itself then? As said, this game would be about conquest, choosing sides, and manipulating the mortal world towards the specific goals of and for one of the various factions. Control of the city would operate on two levels: who is in power among the mortals, and thereafter, who is in power behind the scenes with the vampires. For you gaming enthusiasts out there, imagine the Nemesis system from Shadow of Mordor for the mortal level of control, and then on top of that, the doling out of territory to the various mob bosses in Mafia 3 as a story device for the vampire dimension of control. For example, as in the first game, the map of London would be again divided into districts, and each of these districts would have its own unique complement of mortal and immortal denizens. But in Vampyr 2, an extra factor would be in play, that of either an established controlling mortal entity or a competition between two mortal entities for dominance in each district. Let's say control over the Limehouse docks is in contest between the workers' union and the local shipping conglomerate. In order to find an avenue of control, the player character would have to investigate members of each group to find out what's going on. The player character's class selection will be important here. The workers will be more readily willing to speak with another laborer, while conversely, the aristocratic shipping executives would be more tight-lipped. The reverse would be true if the player had chosen aristocrat, and both sides would be somewhat wary of a middle-class character. Facts about each mortal NPC that could be used as pressure points let me try that again. Facts about each mortal NPC that could be used as pressure points in conversations can be gathered in one of three ways: class affinity, evidence gathering, or eavesdropping. Now, save for class affinity, the mechanics were already in place in the first game. However, it was often the case that certain information on a civilian NPC could only be obtained by finding evidence or only discovered by eavesdropping. In my Dream sequel, important information on most of the NPCs would be structured like the assassinations of the Hitman series, wherein there are various avenues to achieve the same goals. In this case, to find out the same information, rather than being locked into a completely linear procedure. But, like the first game, there should also be certain hard stops that can cut off avenues for finding information or achieving certain goals if the player isn't careful. Saying the wrong thing to the wrong person, or being of the wrong social class, might end your chances of finding something out through conversation. And if a character with vital information is killed before they have a chance to relay it, an eavesdropping opportunity may disappear. As well, the death of one character may cause characters connected to them to change their roles in the story altogether, just as in the first game. Having several options available to the player will add a sense of freedom and as well encourage the player to assume a certain style for their player character. Are they more of a spy than a socialite, or more of a detective than a sneak thief? But as well as finding out facts about the NPCs, the aspect of the first game that is begging for expansion is the relationship map. Imagine this. In that same workers' union versus shipping conglomerate example, imagine if the heads of the shipping company is essentially dead set against negotiating with the union, but the son of the shipping company owner is more amenable to coming to a compromise. The boss is receptive to his son, but is still pretty much set on what he wants. Now, let's say you've taken the side of Lord Redgrave in trying to establish influence over the docks. Redgrave wants the complete dominance of the shipping company, no compromises. Do you do a thorough investigation of the son to find a pressure point to convince him to stop his meddling naturally? Do you charm him supernaturally into seeing things your way, risking the consequences of breaking his will? Or do you simply kill him and leave his body where he might be suspected as a crime undertaken by union members to more solidify the father's attitude? And even further, what if through your investigations, you discover a connection between characters that was not previously shown on the relationship map? What if by finding the right piece of information, you discover the shipping magnate's son is in love with the union leader's daughter? Oh, the drama. Whether you strike a peace between the two groups, nullify one or the other by exploiting the relationships between the people involved is one decision point. Thereafter, who you hand that piece of the pie over to is another. Old Bridget wants the workers' union in a good position so that the living families of her sewer scows have a future. But what happens if you instead hand her a corporate-controlled area, but in doing so you're betraying her hated ex-husband, Lord Redgrave? The story possibilities for intrigues and power struggles for both the mortal and immortal stories are greatly expanded by enhancing the utility of the relationship map and its implications. And what I have described here is a relatively simple use of it. Killing an NPC can now become a tactical move in addition to being a moral question. So many options and so many ways to feel like a scheming secret master of the mortal world. The question for the player becomes, which mortal faction do they side with in the district, and how do they arrange for one to get it over the other, and then which faction of the supernatural world do they entrust it to? Now on to some miscellaneous things I thought about just randomly, about aspects of the first game. Number 1, Vun Colds, or Vun Colds, however they said it. Now, these are the giant gray vampire monsters. Either you redesign or get rid of the Vun Cold bloodline of vampires. There's a lot of suspension I can give to my disbelief, but in a setting that is so relatively grounded in the surface reality of the mortal world, gigantic gray-skinned vampires wearing suits, ties, and bowler hats makes absolutely no sense as anything that could interact with humans and get away with it. Either hand-wave a redesign, or say that the entire bloodline died out or is in hiding. Having a subservient enforcer bloodline is a cool idea, but the execution of it broke the immersion for me in the first game. Number 2, crafting materials in the game should not be so easily collected out in the world. I barely ever had to spend a dime in the first game, save for buying melee weapon handles and gun triggers. And I never had to buy anything from the medical vendors. 95% of everything you'll ever need can be found off enemies or by scavenging. Increase the usefulness of vendors and the risks in losing them due to role-playing decisions more meaningfully by making Let's try that again. Increase the usefulness of vendors and the risks in losing them due to role-playing decisions by more meaningfully making certain materials scarce. Number 3, related to that, control of a particular district in Vampyr 2 should provide benefits to the player character. Perhaps the district itself provides one bonus, and then whichever mortal power controls it provides a separate bonus. Or perhaps the passive bonus provided by the district is modified significantly depending on who controls it. Number 4, reputation scores. Like in Fallout New Vegas, the more you help one faction, the more kindly they should look upon and act towards you. In the beginning of the game, the Ascalon Club members and the sewer scows you encounter in the world might be relatively neutral to your presence, unless or until you choose to attack them. Killing members of a faction degrades your reputation score with that faction, and over time, all such enemies will become either automatically hostile, generally neutral, or at best may aid you in a combat situation. Giving districts over to one faction or another will lock in a certain reputation standing with one faction while possibly degrading it with the others. There may be requisite purges of unwanted faction members from districts before a full supernatural takeover can take place, even if the mortal power struggle is settled. Number 5, the mechanic of your appearance changing to become more monstrous the more you feed on people would go out the door. In the first game, it broke immersion for me to think that Dr. Reed could be talking to people with glowing eyes without any consequence. I also never cared much for the aesthetics of the changes anyway. He looked like he was a Sith Lord or something. Number 6, and lastly, there need to be more save slots and the option to quick save as you please. I can kind of understand the developer's intent in making one's choices permanent to add weight to those choices in a playthrough. But it is an unforgiving process wherein if you make a single mistake, you would have to play the entire campaign all over again to try to correct the mistake. This was especially frustrating in the cemetery fight, where accidentally feeding from the priest and then losing the fight and restarting the battle with the priest alive again still counted against me as a kill in my attempted no human kill run. Players should have a chance to explore their options and learn from their mistakes without having to start all over again. So, there is a lengthy recitation of what I would want to see in my dream sequel to Vampyr. Will there be a sequel in real life? Maybe. And if so, will I get everything I want? Doubtful. All the same, one can hope. As always, thank you for listening.